I'm once again honored to take the stand to introduce the moderator of our second panel of the day, Dr. Patrick Cullinane. Dr. Cullinane is the Lowman-Walton Chair in Theodore Roosevelt Studies and Professor of History at Dickinson State University. He additionally is serving alongside myself as co-interim director of the Theodore Roosevelt Center as we search for a new permanent director. In addition to his work here, Dr. Cullinane also serves as public historian for the Theodore Roosevelt Association and has worked closely with the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library to help design and curate their museum experience when they open in 2026. He's published a number of books, including the award-winning Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, The History and Memory of an American Icon. And in all his free time, he also hosts a podcast, The Gilded Age and Progressive Era, which examines issues about the fascinating era of the 1870s to 1920s. Mike is a strong advocate for us in the world of Theodore Roosevelt, is able to jump in with a microphone on the drop of a hat like we saw last session. Thank you very much, Mike. And he's a great guy. And I'm pleased now to give him the floor to introduce the members of his panel as they prepare to look back to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era to speak about braving the elements, woods, water, and the city in Roosevelt's time. Let's give Mike a hand.
Thanks, Eric, very much. So here's what we're going to do. Everyone's going to come up and talk at the podium here, and we're going to give everyone about 15 minutes of time, which should give us about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. So I would encourage you to hold back your questions until everyone's finished. And we have three distinguished and excellent speakers today. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to be appearing. So first up is Dr. Benjamin Johnson, who's the professor of history at the Department of School of Environmental Sustainability at Loyola University, Chicago. And as he pointed out, we have to continually say Chicago because there are many Loyolas and many Jesuits out there. So he is the author of numerous works on the U.S.-Mexico border and environmental history, including Revolution in Texas, How a Forgotten Rebellion and Its Bloody Suppression Turned Mexicans into Americans, and also Border Town, The Odyssey of an American Place, and my favorite, which is Escaping the Dark Gray City, Fear and Hope in the Progressive Era Conservation. He's also a member of Refusing to Forget, which is a public history project devoted to commemorating the legacies of border violence of the 1910s, which has received awards from the Western History Association, the American Historical Association, and the Organization of American Historians, which, for those of you that might not be familiar, are the big major professional associations in history, so quite distinguished. Johnson has also served as co-editor of the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and he currently co-edits the Weber series in New Borderlands History at the University of North Carolina Press, and is a member of the Texas Institute of Letters and past board member of the Texas State Historical Association. Next up to speak after Dr. Johnson will be Dr. Dario Fazzi, who is a professor of transatlantic environmental history at Leiden University, which is in the Netherlands, and I think might be the record for farthest traveled to this event, so quite a ways. He also teaches and works at the Roosevelt Institute for American Studies at Middelburg, also in the Netherlands, and both of those institutions have done some great things regarding Roosevelt. The Roosevelt Institute of American Studies goes back to 1986, and Leiden University, if you're interested, has a MOOC, a massive open online course called the Roosevelt Century, where you can learn more about Theodore Roosevelt. Dario is the author of Eleanor Roosevelt and the Anti-Nuclear Movement, The Voice of Conscience. And more recently, this is his book that's on sale outside, is Smoke on the Water, Incineration at Sea and the Birth of a Transatlantic Environmental Movement. Now, I've known Dario for years, and I really want to praise his ability to work across disciplines, and he embodies the spirit of creating new knowledge. So I'm really delighted that he's here. And what I mean by that is that he started several groups that have been multidisciplinary research groups like New Diplomatic History, and now a Blue History Network, which is devoted to the study of history from the perspective of water, effectively, from those places that are blue rather than those places that are green. And finally, we have Rachel Lane, who is a programming associate. I said programming administrator, but it's programming associate at the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, which of course is set to open on July 4th, 2026. And that's only a mere 30 miles from here. And in addition to her work for the library, Rachel publishes a monthly newsletter that I wanted to give a big shout out to called Missing Pieces, which is about Theodore Roosevelt. And there's some wonderful stories on there, including one that we brought to life recently about a cocktail that was named after Theodore Roosevelt in 1910 called Teddy's Hat, which we recreated this summer, which was absolutely delicious. And I'm sure Rachel will give you the recipe for it.
And which we'll be having in a few minutes. At lunch, right?
don't show us up. We didn't make that happen, all right? But, we'll give you the recipe. You go home and do it yourself. But, I mean, the newsletter is brilliant. It's got everything from butter sculptures, folk tales, racket sports. She's also, as Kelly pointed out, a former intern at the TR Center, and we're very proud of that. It was several moons ago, but it makes us especially proud to welcome her back to speak at the Theodore Roosevelt Center's Symposium. So without further ado, Dr. Johnson.
Well, thank you very much. I'm pleased and honored to be a part of this year's symposium and want to thank Mike Cullinane and everyone else whose work has made this possible. It's also very strange in my world to go to a conference that is actually on time. So I did want to call that out as well. If you know, you know. So more than any other president, Teddy Roosevelt is associated with environmental reform, and especially in cooperation with Gifford Pinchot, the first head of the Forestry Service, possibly the most influential figure in American political history who was never actually president, and with whom Teddy Roosevelt had what might be called the great bromance of the progressive era. Major steps forward in environmental conservation were taken, and I'm going to just briefly start by summarizing them. On the national level, progressives were perhaps more successful in the realm of environmental management than in any of the other major issues important to them. By 1920, conservationists had brought into being an ambitious environmental state, one still with us nearly a century later. Specialized environmental organizations such as the Audubon Society and the Sierra Club enjoyed a mass base, especially among middle-class women. They joined with broader organizations such as the General Federation of Women's Club to pass national and state wildlife protection laws, to create the national park system and national forests. Countless cities established their own park and forest reserve systems. Landscape architects developed styles of park design and home planning aimed at emulating the aesthetics of wild nature and, bringing a sense of the grandeur of creation into the daily lives of Americans. As we saw in this morning's panel, in the West, vast tracts of the American domain were now permanently managed by specialized federal agencies, which are familiar to all of us, either for the valuable economic benefits of such resources as timber or water, or for the spiritual and recreational attraction of wild nature. Thanks above all to Teddy Roosevelt, the United States Forest Service alone managed a domain of more than 150 million acres, or nearly twice the present size of the nation of Germany. These agencies and bureaucracies drew on and strengthened a cadre of specialized employees trained in environmental disciplines like forestry, wildlife management, et cetera, that we're still familiar with. So the subtitle of this panel, Woods, Water, and the City, is definitely on the mark. And I'd like to put two overarching questions about Teddy Roosevelt and conservation on the table for our consideration. First, what is the nature being saved? And second, who is it being saved for? And who is it being saved from? I've spent years of my life and many thousands of words arguing that the conservation movement was more complicated and more consequential than it has often been given credit for, including by professional historians. It still irritates me to great length to pick up major treatments of this period and have, only a cursory mention of conservation and environmental regulation. With respect to Teddy Roosevelt and the documents that were circulated in conjunction with this panel, I'll answer these questions in two ways. The first is that the engagement with nature represented in Teddy Roosevelt's efforts and the wider conservation movement was broader than we might think. It included cities, urban parks, streets, as well as forests and fields. The phrase saving nature or protecting nature is still a shorthand for environmentalism, and it seems logical, right? There's this thing that's not human, that's nature, that's endangered, and we go out and save it. But it sometimes obscures the ways in which conservationists act, in which the nature was maybe not so natural, right? Had already been transformed by human occupation in a way I think the American environmental tradition continually underestimates. And it also obscures the ways in which conservationists actually created natural spaces, which I know seems paradoxical. City parks from vacant lots, new forests on the Great Plains, the irrigation districts that were an important legacy of particularly the Roosevelt administration as well. Some of us may have looked at Roosevelt's letter to Horace McFarland about hunting in Washington, D.C., and especially Rock Creek Park, again, which is on the the call for this gathering. This letter, and it's brief and it's not in shorthand, so it's worth taking a quick look at. This letter suggests that conservationists were concerned with nature in cities as well as in places like Yosemite and the Badlands that we may most reflexively associate with conservation. This was a major theme of my book, Escaping the Dark Gray City, and Horace McFarland, to whom Roosevelt penned the letter, though little known today, is a major figure in the book precisely because he was committed to making cities places where ordinary people could have access to the non-human world. In this letter, Roosevelt urges McFarland to support restrictions on hunting and the shooting of songbirds and small games in the District of Columbia, describing the animals as, quote, a very real attraction for DC residents, suggesting that many ordinary folk had come to value the animals that they could encounter in urban parks. Roosevelt mentions in particular the importance of Rock Creek Park, an example of the urban parks that city-oriented conservationists like Horace McFarland viewed as critical. So why does the urban aspect of conservation matter? And I realize we're in North Dakota, which may not be as urban as, say, Chicago, right? But why does this matter? I think it shows the democratic and emancipatory side of the progressivism championed by Pinchot and Roosevelt, right? That their environmental efforts, as well as their other policy efforts, weren't just targeted at rich, highly educated elites from the East Coast, even though that's their own background. Most Americans in their lifetime, 1920 is the census that's the turning point, right? Lived in cities. The overwhelming majority of us today live in cities or in suburbs, and the environmental characteristics and reality of those places are of overarching importance. And they keenly felt the environmental harms of industrial life that urbanites were exposed to. I want to give a great quote from Henry George, who was very glad that the introduction this morning featured. So a kind of a social thinker, an economic thinker who posed the challenge in the late 19th century of why a dramatically productive economy like the United States produced poverty and poor people and economic desperation as much as it produced wealth, which is still, a question, a dilemma that we have not solved. George wrote, "The vast populations of these great cities are utterly divorced from all the general influences of nature. The great mass of them, people who live in cities, never, from year's end to year's end, press foot upon Mother Earth or pluck a wild flower or hear the tinkle of brooks, the rustle of grain, or the murmur of leaves as the light breeze comes through the woods. Poverty and economic necessity shut out the inmates of the house of want from the sweet and joyous influences of nature." As with the anti-monopoly measures that Roosevelt is also very well known for, urban park systems were meant to lessen the impact of economic inequality. I suspect that many of us in this room are familiar with and have benefited from their existence. In my case, living in the Twin Cities in Minnesota and now living in Chicago, I get to live in a city and I'm not totally cut off from the wider natural world. So on this first question, my answer does what I assume happens at a lot of gatherings about the legacy of past presidents, including at the TR Center. We talk about the continued importance and relevance of these figures and their commitments, right? And, if we were to ask people, like, do you support, the kind of public opinion questions that are asked today by pollsters, like, do you approve of the job Teddy Roosevelt is doing? I'm guessing we'll get a resounding yes, right, from this crowd, or we wouldn't be here. The second question I raise is, who is nature being protected from, and who is it being protected for? My answer to this question is much less flattering for Roosevelt and many, though not all, of his white conservationist compatriots. The biggest change in the historical study of American environmentalism, at least by professional historians, in the last 20 years, is the rise of what might be called a social history of conservation. Instead of approaching conservation as a matter of cultural, intellectual, or political history, where the key actors are famous and powerful people like Teddy Roosevelt, these scholars approach it from the vantage of social history, asking how conservation changed the lives of ordinary people, particularly in communities in and around national forests and national parks, where the power of the federal government and the decisions of unelected bureaucracies then as well as now have enormous consequences for the livelihoods of ordinary people. When reading a document like Roosevelt's letter to McFarland, these researchers would be inclined to ask questions like, who was hunting these birds and animals? What role did that hunting play in their lives and livelihoods? What happened when it became illegal? Their answers to such questions are hard to square with a heroic history of environmentalism, in which the main plot line is how enlightened people like Teddy Roosevelt save us from environmental destruction. Conservation bureaucracies and regulations criminalize hunting, fishing, and the gathering of food and timber by rural communities across the country. And they didn't always, this is not something I'll pick up, but they didn't always actually deliver environmental sustainability. Conservation's record is very mixed at best. At the same time, they opened up these resources to sports hunters and tourists, generally middle and upper class people who lived in cities. It's certainly true, as one of the panelists observed this morning, that the American hunting tradition is cast as anti-aristocratic, right? But nonetheless, there were major divisions and inequalities, particularly after the coming of conservation. The result was arrests and alienation from direct access to natural resources. The research I did early in my career showed how much mining companies in key iron mining districts of Minnesota used the criminalization of subsistence to force their workers into reliance on wage labor and to weaken their hands in the region's protracted and often violent labor struggles. And you could be someone who grew up in a city like I did and still understand there's a reason why game wardens across rural America are not necessarily like the most popular people, right, where they live. For better or for worse. Particularly on federal land, these laws were enforced by agents who were not hired by local elected government. Yellowstone, for example, was run by the Army for decades, and the head of the park was called the Czar of Wonderland by locals who did not mean that as a compliment. In extreme cases, these conflicts resulted in such alienation from nature that locals resorted to the burning of forests and the slaughter of elk herds managed by Park Service. Conservation was particularly disastrous for Native peoples, especially in the U.S. West, where the federal government's domain and reach were particularly strong. In the name of environmental protection, Bannock, Shoshone, Blackfoot, Havasupai, Yosemite, and other groups were entirely removed from large tracts of territory and denied rights to hunt, fish, gather, and conduct religious ceremonies. This despite the fact that they had in many cases explicitly reserved these rights in treaty negotiations because they were so important to them. In many places, from an Indian point of view, conservation looked like another chapter in the story of white people in uniform with guns showing up and doing bad things. This dispossession and bitterness is also a part of the legacy of conservation and Teddy Roosevelt. They are well remembered across rural America, especially in Indian country. And I'm sure others in this room and on the Zoom know more about this than I do, but we're not far from the Fort Berthold Reservation where Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara have been terribly mistreated by conservation bureaucracies in the generations after Teddy Roosevelt. The writer David Troyer, who grew up on the Leech Lake Reservation in Minnesota, recently argued for the return of national parks to the authority of tribal governments. Writing in a 2021 Atlantic article, he states that I wanted to begin my journey at the Theodore Roosevelt Park because no one embodies the tensions of the park system as it is currently constituted, like the 26th president. Contained in the person, I'm still quoting, in the person of Roosevelt was a wild love for natural vistas and a propensity for violent imperialism, an overwhelming desire for freedom and a readiness to take it away from other people. Much of the park named after him sits on the land of Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. They lost that land in 1851 with the signing of the first Treaty of Fort Laramie, and executive orders in 1870 and 1880 seized still more of the tribe's homeland. And it's important to note, I'm now back in my own words, it's important to note that this dispossession was not accidental. This was not done not understanding its consequences. Roosevelt was quite familiar with Native Americans, including from his time in Dakota Territory. The most vicious cowboy, he wrote, has more moral principle than the average Indian. In a speech in which he also famously declared, I don't go so far as to think the only good Indians are the dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely in the case of the 10th. So now, as well as then, when we speak of protecting nature, we ought to ask who it is being protected from and who it is being protected for. If you value democracy and believe in the dignity of all God's children, some of those answers should be unsettling. Nonetheless, as today's program indicates, the conservation tradition that Teddy Roosevelt played such an important role in developing remains pressingly relevant today, and if we engage with it critically, can be an indispensable tool for a sustainable and prosperous future. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was very stimulating. So we're going to move on to we'll take questions at the end, so please jot them down or get your phones out and put the notes in. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Fazzi.
Adjust this to Italian standards. Hi, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor. To me, it's like closing a circle. I work at a fellow Rooseveltian institution. It's called the Roosevelt Institute for American Studies, and it's located in Middelburg, a southwestern town in the Netherlands. And the reason why that institute named after the Roosevelt is located there is because there is where the ancestors of the Roosevelt family came from. So we carry out the Rooseveltian, the global Rooseveltian legacy, as well as our fellow hosts are doing down here. I'm really glad to be part of these. I want to thank Mike and all the people who have been putting this together. It's fantastic. But I have two big disclaimers to give you at the very beginning of my talk. The first thing is personal. I'm Italian, I work in the Netherlands, and I study American history. So I have like a huge conflict, especially of languages and accents, running through my head constantly. So if there's something that you don't understand what I'm saying, it's not your fault, it's definitely mine. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. This is also what my students do, so please do it. And the second one is that I'm not an expert on Theodore Roosevelt whatsoever. I mean, I could pretend to be, but I'm not. I've been writing a book in the past about her, perhaps Theodore Roosevelt's most famous niece was Eleanor Roosevelt. So my personal encounters as a scholar, as a historian with Theodore Roosevelt, were through the eyes and the lenses and the experiences of Eleanor for most of the things that I was writing. But gladly, well, sometimes, you know, life brings you not only lemon, but also nice things, right? Like this symposium, which gave me the opportunity to reflect about the ways in which the things that I'm doing now may be connected to Theodore Roosevelt's legacies and to what we have been talking about today, so conservationism, sustainability, and how we may learn from the past about things that are happening also today. So with this in mind, I started thinking what could be the role that Theodore Roosevelt's personal life and political trajectory played in the definition of the relationship between the United States as a country, as a government, as a nation, as a people, and global waters, global water resources, because that is the very specific focus, the topic of my own research. And I think that in this regard, TR's approach to water resources reflect almost perfectly the contradictory ways in which the United States has contributed to the transformation of our global water systems. But at the same time, it also reflects, you know, the ways in which our contemporary visions of water rights and water justice have been shaped. Now, this thing is particularly important because every time we study American history, and I can tell you also when we study American history from Europe, it's most of the time a land-centric perspective. It's all about land, territorial expansion and aggrandizement, the land of the free, right? But the United States has been built mostly through the exploitation of water resources, not land. America's continental expansion occurred through the creation of a so-called hydraulic West, which reconfigured the region and the nation's ecological aspect. The rapid industrialization following the gold rush, the plantation economy in the South, the commodification of waterways were crucial to shaping modern America and institutionalizing at the same time what Ben was talking about, an unequal access to water resources across the country. Now, the control of river deltas and estuaries, infrastructural investment along the coastline, the strengthening of naval power, especially in the Gulf, and the making of the US as an oceanic nation completed, basically, the process of imperial building of the United States. Now, the transformation of the United States into what the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has aptly defined as an aquatic nation means that we need to realize that the United States nowadays is mostly made by water. Look at this. The United States has jurisdiction over 13,000 miles of coastline, 3.4 million square nautical miles of the oceans, and 6.5 quadrillion gallons of fresh water. So this is like the largest owner of water resources in the world. That's it. Since the United States has been built with this capacity, with this power in mind, it is legit to ask ourselves, what has been the role of the United States in the, let's face it, rather messy situation we have in front of us today? So what has been the role of the United States in the degradation of our global watery resources? What has been the role of the United States in the so-called Great Acceleration, so that particularly impactful and seemingly irreversible anthropogenic degradation of the planet biosphere? US-driven progress has led to an almost tenfold increase in global water use. The growth and expansion of the US military complex, the multiplication of extractive technologies, the dependency on ever-growing energy needs, a vision of progress connected to unceasing growth, and the replication of instances of toxic colonialism, these have been like the most important markers that the United States' rise to world power has left into our world. Now, think about this, without even taking into consideration AI, okay, because then we step into uncharted territory. But Google has released in 2022 data on the amount of water that it uses, of fresh water, and it's 5.6 billion gallons of fresh water per year just to cool down its data server. Okay? And that's Google. That's just Google. Now, such a dire rendering of US history needs to be balanced against the concurrent emergence of important legislative measures, restorative actions, and mitigating strategies that US citizens have been demanding and that the US government, in a way or in another, has been providing. An expensive regulatory approach has progressively taken care of restorative actions, trying to bring about justice where water rights were denied. Slowly, water rights and justice have come to be embedded in a wider system of interdependent interests, shared governance, grassroots initiatives, and multi-channel advocacy. We had an example of all of these in the first panel this morning. That has eventually affected water policies, not only in this country, because the good thing of the United States is that it can lead the world. So this kind of domestic developments have been influencing also how water policies and water rights have been managed abroad and globally. Now, Theodore Roosevelt perfectly epitomizes and embodies this duality, these contradictions between exploitative approaches and a tendency to reform approaches to water, to global waters. In TR, we find simultaneously a view of water resources as crucial tools for the fulfillment of US imperial ambitions and a reformative spirit, focusing on the universal value of water bodies that has eventually led to the institutionalizations of forms of environmental democracy, both in this country and abroad. Now, these are all the ideas of a historian, right? So historians usually try to ground these ideas on primary sources, and there is when the TRC library, digital library, comes in handy, especially if you're doing this from Europe, right? Because then you can go there, check the documents, and see, okay, am I right? Am I wrong? What was TR saying? And it's incredibly interesting to see that he really had this dual approach to water through the letters and the papers that you can consult through the TRC digital library. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy, for instance, TR had a modern view of the Navy. He thought that the Navy was the most crucial instrument to the growth of the United States. But this interest in Navy and in Navy capacities predates his appointment as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and comes from his mother. In several letters, in a letter that he wrote when he was accepting the job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in Washington, he said that it was his mother who talked to him, as he wrote, about ships, 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 and fighting of ships till they sank into the depths of my soul. During his studies at Harvard, and he developed an intellectual interest in the role that navies played in a world where the oceans acted as conduits of modern civilization. And there, then, he got interested in naval theory and naval power and in what Mahans was writing. TR was also the very first president who understood that this nation, in order to be a great nation, like a huge player in the world, needed to be a transoceanic nation. And that came to be with the building of the Panama Canal, right? But that infrastructure was only one of the many water infrastructures that TR had in mind in order to make this nation modern. One project that eventually failed, but was kind of a forerunner of what eventually happened with the Mississippi, was this very famous 14 feet through the valley project, which was a project that aimed to establish a network of inland waterways, canals, and river improvements going from the Great Lakes to the Gulf, and that was supposed to grant American agricultural and industrial outputs direct access to global markets. And in TR's view, this was functional to sustaining America's imperial ambition, economic growth, and prosperity. Now, historians, of course, see these things and then they ask themselves, okay, but which was TR's approach to this particular resource? And one of the greatest historians of TR and the conservation era, Jan Tyrrell, says that TR's approach to global waters was prudent. I think it was something different than prudent. It was pragmatic. It was utilitarian. He wanted to put water to the good use of people, and that's how we say, that's how he defines. The good use becomes central. He didn't want any water to be wasted. That was his bottom line. And he wanted water to be managed mostly through small-scale irrigation projects. These, like small-scale projects, he thought were the best ways to grant water for everybody, because local communities understand local needs better than anybody else. And then he thought that the federal government had the major role in supervising everything, in making sure that especially private companies could not profit too much from the management of water resources. In a country where today 98% of potable waters is managed by private companies, TR may sound just a little bit radical, but perhaps he was right. If you think about what Google is doing, especially today, right? TR's insistence on the necessity to establish federal control and oversight of water resources is one of the most important, I think also forgotten, legacies of his era. Writing to governors, senators, and congressmen on the topic of water rights, TR reiterated many times his opposition to any bill granting perpetual rights and privileges to private corporations, stigmatizing what will become one of the worst vices of American industrial capitalism. So you can see this through the letters, really. Every time there was a big dam project, for instance, crossing his desk, he asked only one question: what are the consequences of this? Who's going to get the water? Okay, we are producing electricity, but who's going to remain without water? Then, yeah, perhaps, as Ben showed you before, he couldn't do much. But the very fact that he asked that question, that he believed that the federal government had to be invested with that responsibility to redistribute such a crucial resource as water in a fair way, is something that we should perhaps reflect upon. Now, since TR's times, uneven and unfair socio-ecological developments have characterized the politics of water in the United States and beyond it. Structural environmental exploitation and injustice have marked the construction of large-scale dams, canal, and irrigation systems, as well as the growth of water-consuming technologies, the crafting of sanitation reforms, and the overall management and control of water resources. Against this backdrop, several forms of especially indigenous and local resistance, as I explain in the book that was mentioned before, I mean, it's still available up until the time in which Deep Purple will file a lawsuit against me because of the title. Against this backdrop, I was saying, forms of indigenous and local resistance have emerged and coalesced into a complex modern struggle for water rights that has reverberated well beyond the geographical boundaries of this country. Now, while calling for the same kind of federal engagement that TR promoted and envisioned, one of the main achievements of this struggle has been the relatively recent international recognition of the right to equitable access to clean water as an indispensable, fundamental human right, right? We need water, fresh water especially, to live a life in dignity. I'm sure that TR would be happy at least with this development. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fazzi. And in case anyone wants to ask a question about how much water usage the TR Center uses, we don't know. Don't ask. All right. It's not Google, but I'm sure, you know, with servers and all that, it's. Thank you, Dario. Rachel.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Lane, and I'm the Programming Associate at the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. It's a pleasure to be here at the TR Symposium, as the TR Center is near and dear to my heart after my incredible year-long internship with the organization from 2020 to 2021. I'd like to thank Mike Cullinane, William Hansard, Eric Johnson, Kelly Hyland, Gemma Kuntz, Jeff Wells, and Clay Jenkinson for all of their hard work in putting this symposium together. It's been a privilege to learn from the other presenters about TR and conservation, and I'm looking forward to continuing to discover more as the day goes on. Now, to talk about Theodore Roosevelt and bison, or bison, depending on how connected you are to NDSU and the Fargo-Moorhead area. When Europeans first came to the United States, the American bison covered the continent and numbered 30 to 60 million. In the mid to late 1800s, Americans, mostly men of European backgrounds, felt they had the right to hunt bison, including Theodore Roosevelt himself, which led to the near extinction of the species. By 1900, fewer than 1,000 bison remained. The magnitude of the slaughter was unprecedented. It equated to 2 or more bison killed nonstop, every minute of every day, of every week, of every month, of every year, for 40 years between 1860 to 1900. Roosevelt himself was part of this buffalo killing boom, killing his first bison in 1883 at the age of 24, though he was at the tail end of the extermination of the bison. Various people argued for bison conservation on a federal level between 1870 and 1890, but all efforts fell flat. In response to a lack of governmental intervention, a variety of conservation organizations were founded in the late 1800s and early 1900s to address the increasingly pressing need for wildlife protection and preservation. One of these organizations was the American Bison Society, founded in 1905 to raise public awareness about the bison and to save the species from extinction. Their plan was to purchase bison and reintroduce them into the wild. The first bison reintroduction occurred in 1907 when 15 bison were shipped from the New York Zoological Park, known today as the Bronx Zoo, to the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge and Game Preserve in Oklahoma. When the American Bison Society approached Roosevelt in 1907, and asked for his support during their second campaign to raise funds for a Montana national bison herd, the president was happy to oblige. By this time, Roosevelt had begun to realize the importance of bison conservation. As early as the 1890s, Roosevelt had recognized the plight of the bison, writing in a handwritten draft of a chapter on bison for hunting the grizzly and other sketches. Mixed with the eager excitement of the hunter, I felt a certain half-melancholy feeling as I gazed on these bison, themselves part of the last remnant of a doomed and nearly vanished race. By the early 1900s and his presidency, Roosevelt wanted to do more to bring an end to the extermination of the bison. Roosevelt became the first sitting president to argue for the preservation of the bison in his fourth annual message in 1904, saying, "We owe it to future generations to keep alive the noble and beautiful creatures which by their presence add such distinctive character to the American wilderness." 2 years later, in 1906, he stated unequivocally in a letter to Roy N. Dunn that white men were the most culpable in the near extermination of the bison, stating he had seen it firsthand. The extermination of the American bison in the 15 years culminating in 1883 had nothing whatever to do with climatic condition. It was due to the number of hunters. The man with a rifle was the sole appreciable active force. Grouping himself in the category of people who contributed to the near extermination of the bison, Roosevelt seemed to acknowledge his culpability as well. Thus, when Ernest Harold Baines, secretary of the American Bison Society, wrote to Roosevelt on behalf of the organization on October 22, 1907, asking for a short letter to include in Country Life in America, a magazine, Roosevelt replied back 2 days later expressing support for the American Bison Society and its mission. It would be a real misfortune to permit the species to become extinct, and I hope that all good citizens will aid the society in its efforts for its preservation. Country Life in America published this letter in the January 1908 issue at the beginning of an article by Baines entitled "The Fight to Save the Buffalo." The ABS invited both men and women to join the cause and raise funds for the Montana National Bison Herd, stating, "The American Bison Society is trying to accomplish a work which will benefit the whole country, and it asks the whole country to bear a hand." Intriguingly, ABS leaders didn't expect women to be interested in bison conservation. William Temple Hornaday, the first director of the New York Zoological Park, noted with surprise in the 1908 and 1909 annual report, "Notwithstanding the widespread interest taken by women in the protection of birds, it was not expected by the undersigned that the plan for the creation of a national bison herd in Montana would strongly appeal to women." In fact, 112 women contributed over 10% of the funds, donating $1,227 of the $10,560.50 raised that year for the ABS, or roughly $40,000 out of $350,000 in today's dollars, according to the 1908-1909 annual report. The first subscription for the Montana National Bison Herd came from a woman, Emma L. Mee, and the person who raised the second largest sum via subscriptions outside of the president's office, and that's not President Roosevelt, that's president of the American Bison Society, was Ethel Randolph Clark Thayer, known as Mrs. Ezra R. Thayer. Thayer was elected to the Board of Managers and appears to be the only woman of the 26 members. Thanks to the financial support of Americans across the country and the efforts of pioneering conservationists like Roosevelt, Baines, and Hornaday, the ABS worked with several organizations in the early 1900s to reintroduce bison into the wild. The Montana herd, for which the ABS raised subscriptions from 1908 to 1909, was sent to the National Bison Range in Montana in 1910, located inside the Flathead Indian Reservation. The range had been established out of a portion of the reservation on May 23, 1908, when Roosevelt signed legislation authorizing the use of funds to purchase this land for bison conservation after Congress appropriated the money to buy the land specifically for wildlife conservation, the first act of its kind. Initially, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Michel Pablo and Charles Allard had managed the bison herd on the Flathead Reservation in Montana before the creation of the National Bison Range, until the Flathead Allotment Act of 1904 caused the loss of 60% of the reservation for the Confederated tribes. After an inability to maintain the bison herd on the allotted land, Pablo tried to sell his herd to the U.S. government, but Congress refused to purchase it. He instead sold his herd to the Canadian government in 1907. Some of the Pablo Allard herd did make it to the newly created National Bison Refuge. Of the 40 bison that formed the original herd, 36 were connected to the Pablo Allard herd, at one time the largest herd of plains bison in the world. Little thought was given to the reduction of the Confederated tribes' homeland when the range was created. It wouldn't be until 2021, 113 years later, that the land that comprised the National Bison Range, approximately 18,800 acres, was returned to the Confederated tribes, who are now the stewards of the bison herd. Today, the bison is alive and well in the United States. Declared America's national mammal by President Barack Obama in 2016, the bison continues to capture the American imagination. A lot of work has been done in the past 150 years to save the bison, but it is a continual process to make sure that gains are not lost. Roughly 1/3 of all wild bison, numbering around 10,000 in North America, live in herds on public lands. Although bison are no longer endangered, discussions surrounding rights and responsibilities of bison hunting, the species itself, and its habitat exist to this day. The American Bison Society of Roosevelt's day continued to reintroduce bison into the wild, with the last reintroduction occurring in the Pisgah National Forest and Game Preserve in North Carolina in 1919. The organization was disbanded in 1935 when it was determined that the species had been successfully saved. However, the organization experienced a rebirth in 2005 when the Wildlife Conservation Society relaunched the American Bison Society with a new focus: to promote the preservation of the species for the future. Other modern efforts for bison conservation occurred around the same time, with the establishment of a large-scale prairie restoration initiative in Montana in 2001 that is now known as the American Prairie Reserve. This is one of many efforts to restore the habitat of the bison and to create the largest wildlife reserve in the continental United States. Roosevelt's conservation efforts to save the American bison weren't perfect. While his use of the presidential platform to increase public awareness of the need to preserve the bison made a difference in the fight to save the bison, his actions also had ramifications for indigenous people across the country, as their homelands were often taken away from them. Today, indigenous people have a greater voice in bison conservation than they did in the early 1900s. Christina Einsberg, an indigenous ecologist, noted in an article about bison conservation for the Smithsonian Magazine. Bison conservation will not succeed unless it is in collaboration with Native people and incorporates traditional ecological knowledge that empowers those communities, and it honors them and helps them heal some from all the damage that has been done. Thank you.
Well, I think you'll agree that those three presentations were really stimulating, and I think all really show how complex it is, but also there's common threads here about federal, local cooperation. Does it work? Does it not work? Normally, I would just throw this open to everyone, and I'm sure you'll have some thoughts about all of these topics, and we can discuss them further. But I just thought for a moment when you all were speaking that the responsibility for conservation and sustainability, I feel like I'm getting older. I'm definitely middle-aged, or maybe past that now. And the younger generation really has the responsibility, and they also will have to face the consequences of those decisions as well, whereas my responsibility is ebbing, as is the likelihood that I'm going to face any apocalyptic future, hopefully, fingers crossed. So with that in mind, would it be possible, and I know this is putting you on the spot, there's several students in the audience, can we ask you for your questions first? And I know that's putting you on your spot, but if you raise your hand, William will kindly come around and give you the microphone and offer you an opportunity to speak first.
What brought you to researching these topics?
So yeah, great question. Thanks for going. I guess I was drawn to it. I think like everyone here, by my own experiences in nature and my own environmental commitments. So I was kind of on this track as far back in college, and for me, a formative experience. I won't give you my whole autobiography, although it's deeply fascinating in all of its minor details. Was working in a former mining town that's now a big wilderness tourism place in northeastern Minnesota, and I was the boat boy was my title, which is much cooler than professor. I maintained witty diesel generators from the 30s and 40s. We were off the grid, and I drove into town a couple of times a week and bought $800 of groceries, and I just loved it, and I was attracted for the nature reasons, for the wilderness. And then I was pals with the guy who ran the stock room at the town's main grocery store, and we really hit it off. It was weird to me, like he hated environmentalists, and there was a cartoon about wiping your ass with a spotted owl. I hope I can say that. You can censor it out on the YouTube video. And I was just mystified by why people in this town might be so resentful of me, basically, right? Of people like me, of kind of urban, educated, environmentally oriented people. And so I looked into the history and found that, they had a reason to be, and that there was this kind of paradox and tension. So that was what drew me into this.
So I became interested in bison conservation after the release of Ken Burns' documentary, The American Buffalo, and I was curious what materials were available in the digital library related to bison conservation. So I worked on a small little article for my newsletter last year based on that interest, and I did more research, obviously, to prepare for this presentation. But the thing that really struck me was the lack of acknowledgement for the role of women in conserving bison, and so that was something I wanted specifically to discuss.
For what concerns my interest in American history, I won't tell that. That's part of. I'm off. Okay. So for what concerns my interest in U.S. history, as somebody who was born in Sicily, it comes from the fact that I was living actually with Americans almost every day of my life because of an American base, an American military base that was next to the town where I was living. It was the U.S. among us, basically, that drew me into this field. For what concerns water and the issue of the exploration of the socio-ecological impact that the American military-industrial complex has been having throughout its history, it comes from the realization that most, if not all, of our most urgent climate challenges and changes are related to water. Sea level rise, extreme weather events, floods, even, modification of soils that happens through water, toxic pollution. It all goes through the anthropogenic transformation of the water cycles of this planet, which, if we don't stop this, there won't be very likely a planet anymore. So my idea as a historian is to understand how we got to this point, right? So this is what historians try to do. They ask questions about origins of things that are happening today. And I'm finding many of the answers I was looking for in the historical development of the relationship between this country, your country, and global water systems.
So one of the one of the questions that I want to ask to all of you historians is we have this tremendous accomplishment, even if it's compromised in some ways, by Theodore Roosevelt, putting 230 million acres into the public trust at a time when America has always had this very aggressive approach towards using its resources, free enterprise, do your own thing. It must have been received, you would think, with a huge amount of pushback. What are you doing taking all this out of our, our use? You're taking away mines, you're taking away rangeland, you're taking away forests, we want to log all this stuff. How was it that Roosevelt was able to accomplish this? And what are the lessons, you would think you're going to be impeached for what you've just done. Yet in fact, he became an icon that we still revere to this day. What was his particular, political skill? What was particularly going on in America at that time that we can learn from today to take on the challenges that are still to be met and preserve our democracy and preserve the planet? What are the lessons of history? That's the question.
Okay, I would say like there are a couple of lessons, even though we should also be wary of the fact that history very seldom repeats itself, right? So, but if there's one thing in Theodore Roosevelt's experience that we can learn is that he was resolute in his actions. So whenever he was convinced that something had to be done in order to preserve a superior good, he did it. And this idea of public service as being at the service of the people is something that we may have lost along the way. And I say this as an external observer of the American political system.
So that's a great question. I mean, I feel like it's a profound question for anybody who lives in this country to be asking themselves. I guess I would I would make one observation and point to three things. I mean, one observation is, yes, he achieved these things. No, he was hated for it. He was despised in certain corners. I think we retrospectively look at these great figures and think they were widely popular, right? My students think everybody loved Martin Luther King, and that's not the case, right? It's not the case with Roosevelt. So I think accepting a certain amount of discord, right, and a certain amount of pushback and dislike is just inherent to any substantial project is part of the answer here. I guess I'd point to three things. One is the use of federal power, right? He thought that the federal government existed to address these problems, to serve the interests of the American people, and that you needed a vigorous executive, operating in constitutional grounds, but a vigorous executive to do these things. There was an intellectual and technical backdrop and expertise that justified these things, right? So you have all sorts of thinkers pointing out actual environmental destruction and pointing to ways that they could be solved. And then thirdly, you have a larger movement, right? A conservation movement and an awakening of environmental consciousness that allows for someone like that, someone like Roosevelt to achieve what he did. In this sense, I think the limitations of a great man approach to history can cause us to miss those things. And then finally, I just observe, it's melancholy for me to contemplate this now, right? And to ask which of these institutions, which of these factors do we still have now? And I think, what would be perhaps one of the most heartbreaking things for him now to return is to see that one of the major institutions of our democracy, where, the United States is a two-party system, and has been since its inception. And Teddy Roosevelt's Republican Party, to succeed in that nationally, you now have to pretend that very real and very pressing environmental questions like climate change simply don't happen. There's an outright contempt and attack on any kind of expertise as just being, woke, pointy-headed people from universities who are up to no good. So it's a very important question, and one with maybe sobering answers today.
I think the only thing I'll add is that the majority of the executive orders that Theodore Roosevelt issued during his presidency, which is greater than the number of all of the previous orders, executive orders that had been issued, were related to conservation. So I think he had a very strong sense not only of executive power, but specifically as it related to conservation. And I think that's probably due to the fact that the federal government and Congress had discussed in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s about conservation efforts, and it just wasn't getting pushed through. And so I think Theodore Roosevelt used the presidency in order to be able to do that.
Got time for one more. I'm going to take one from this side of the room. Yep.
I guess earlier we were asked about, are you optimistic about where we're at? So much about TR's writings is talking about the exploitation of resources in the present and not looking with foresight. And I'm curious to hear your perspective on that question, as we are in a really difficult time in a lot of respects, but are you optimistic? You all work with students, so.
I think Rachel was most optimistic in a way. I mean, that was because it worked, right?
So I think I want to speak to something that Dr. Johnson intimated. I think that conservation is an area that both sides, both Democrats and Republicans, can come together on. Sometimes it's just the terminology even that's used, and I know that there are groups that have been formed in the past years to try to get Republicans specifically more involved in conservation and considerations about the environment. I can't remember exactly what the organization is named, but I know the abbreviation is ACC, and I think it's American Conservative Coalition or something like that. And they're trying to do a grassroots work in different, basically identifying as conservatives, but also recognizing different environmental concerns. And so I think that from that perspective, it's important to get a lot of different people on board in considering issues with the climate and the planet. And so I'm optimistic about the fact that there are different grassroots organizations, and I think that that's where you could see a lot of change.
We must resist the temptation to plunder the... Now? Is it better? Okay. So we must resist the temptation to plunder the resources of today for our ease and convenience. This is like President Eisenhower in his farewell address. And he was warning against the risk of living just for today, consuming the possibilities of future generations. And it's the famous address when he defines the military-industrial complex as the most dangerous elements of the the degradation of American democracy. I am optimistic. We have to be. There's Republic N also on the conservative side, which is a great example of how conservationist efforts have been carried out by also conservative circles, even though they are a minority at the moment within their own party. I'm optimistic for the very simple fact that if you consider one of the main solutions to the pressing and urgent crisis, environmental crisis that we are confronted with today, to lie in forms of environmental democracy, which consist of recognition of environmental rights, raising awareness and participation of citizens in democratic ways in the environmental policy making. Well, the United States still has a lot to teach the world. And rediscovering these possibilities of empowering people, especially for what concerns the environmental needs of their localities, will be the key to solve many of the issues that we are confronted with today. It's just a matter of seeing whether the power of local communities will will be able to compete with the power of major corporations that sometimes determine the orientation of the politics of this country.
That is such a great question about optimism and pessimism. I really do. I sometimes give in to despair. I mean, I have to admit. I mean, I think it's counterproductive. It's a sin in a certain way from a certain Christian perspective. And a lot of my colleagues on the natural sciences side will tell me, like, literally they are in therapy. Seriously, right? The sense that they've devoted their life to this and they view runaway environmental destruction caused by climate change as something that is happening and that we're not stopping. And I get that, and I think the source of that fear is something that actually the progressives were not good. Pinchot and Roosevelt were not good at seeing. I think they thought that the more technical knowledge we have about nature, the more we know about nature, the better technology we have, the more we're going to be able to address these problems. And the United States today is the world's richest and most scientifically and technologically accomplished society in the history of the planet, and we risk just denying the reality of overarching destructive climate change. And if our political system can't produce a serious engagement with it, it's simply not going to be dealt with successfully on the world stage, because we are such a power, right? The United States is still the linchpin of the global order. On the other hand, when I go to panels seriously like yours this morning, or when I go to my classes and I see all different kinds of people from all different kinds of background, and people who have been Americans and living on the same land for 4 or 5 generations, and people who have come to this country from other places as small children, and the love for this place, and their devotion and creativity, I think it's irresponsible of me to despair. And so yeah, I'm grateful for my students, and that seems like such a lame, like, Hollywood answer, but it's like a beauty pageant, right? Like, I just want to help the children, right? But that's what I get from teaching, and that's what I see. That's what I saw this morning.
You heard it here. Save the children. No, but work together. I mean, there's themes that we can draw on, I think, and hopefully we're all thinking about this as the symposium is progressing, and we get to the point where we're talking about the places where we can find consensus on this. And I think there's a lot more of them than our disagreements, actually, because a lot of this is just common sense that we all share. So I want to thank our panelists, please, in the normal manner that we do. And I believe there's lunch, so William, if you want to.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you to the panelists. That was fascinating, and I'm loving seeing all of these different angles that we can come at this topic from. I've been really enjoying it.